In this video, we're going to be talking about two different types of congruency and how we can use that to prove whether two triangles are congruent. First method we're going to try out is called SAS, which is an acronym that stands for side, angle, side. So the name is going to tell you exactly what the triangle looks like. You're going to have two sides and an angle in between that are corresponding and congruent on both triangles. If you have a protractor, then you can follow along and draw this. Otherwise, you can just listen to my words and see what happens. In this left triangle, which we're given, we can measure the bottom length, find out it's about 7 centimeters. We could then measure this length AB, and it's about 4 centimeters. And if we measure the side that is in between, the angle that is in between the two sides here, so angle B, use a protractor and we get it to be about 38 degrees. So to use side, angle, side, I really only need to know that these three pieces are corresponding and congruent on another triangle, and the rest of these unknown measured pieces are going to magically fall into place and be the exact same. So over here what I did is I measured a base length of 7 centimeters. I then measured an angle opening about 38 degrees. I drew a side length there. It didn't matter what size it was at first. I then measured 4 centimeters from that point, marked it, and now if I connect those points right there to make that third side, then we have two congruent triangles because of side, angle, side congruency. So this angle up top should be the same even though I didn't measure or draw it. This angle measured down here should be the same even though I didn't measure or draw it. And this side length should actually be the same despite the fact that I did not measure or draw it. So I only needed these three pieces and the rest of the corresponding pieces became congruent. So that's the power of side, angle, side. Let's see if we can recognize whether two triangles have that congruency. In these two pairs of triangles, we're given some markings or some measures, and let's see if we can recognize side, angle, side here. In the left pair, we have two sides that measure 2.5 centimeters, so they are corresponding and congruent. We have two side lengths that measure 1.7 centimeters. They are corresponding and congruent. So let's check if we have an angle in between those two sides that is corresponding and congruent. Well, we do. We're given that angle marking saying that D and G are the same angle measure. So we have side, angle, side. Because the two triangles are congruent, we can finish off this congruency statement. Make sure to match up corresponding parts. So what corresponds with angle D, we know by the symbol angle G does. And what is corresponding to either angle E, or you can say what corresponds to side length DE here. So DE corresponded with GH, so H must correspond with E, and lastly J and F correspond, so we name those letters last. Over in this next pair in part B, we have a pair of corresponding side lengths that are the same, CB and FE. Another pair of sides, AB and ED, have the same symbols. So do we have the angle in between those two sides on both triangles? Well, we do on the left one, but angle E is missing its congruency marking. It's saying that F and B are congruent, so those don't correspond. They don't give us that side, angle, side congruence. Because they're not congruent, please don't complete the congruency statement that says they are congruent. That would be counterproductive. All right, let's see if we can complete a two-column proof. We're given some statements up here. We're given two statements, and we're asked to prove that these two triangles are congruent. We have a 5-step process that we've been practicing in class. Let's go through those 5 steps. The first step is to rewrite the first given statement. And your reason is always because it's given. If we've stated it, let's make sure it's drawn and the markings are evident in our illustration or diagram. So is AB congruent to AD? Well, not yet, so let's give it the markings here. So draw in those hash marks. Now, because it's illustrated or drawn and it's stated, we're ready to go on to the next step, which is just to repeat that process. Let's go on to the next given statement. Angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Again, your reason is because it's given. And that is also not drawn yet, so let's make sure and put those angle markings, those arcs, in the 1 and 2 spot there. All right, so if we've used up our given statements, the next step is to write a plan to come up with that missing piece. Oftentimes the given statements give you 2 out of the 3 parts needed, and so the plan just helps you finish it off. So if we go one direction here, I'm just looking at the top triangle, I have this angle piece and this side piece that comes next. So I have angle side blank. If I move to the next piece, it would be an angle. So I could have angle side angle, but I don't know anything and I'm not given anything about angles B and D. Maybe they're congruent, but I don't have any information to prove it at the moment. So let's see if there's another option. If I go the other direction and start with my side length here, so my S, and then I move to my A, and then the next part that I would come to is this segment or side here. Let's see if we can come up with a reason why that would be congruent. Because it's the same segment, just part of 2 different triangles, we know it's congruent to itself. And so we could have side angle side if we just say that segment AC is congruent to itself. So this is kind of a new statement that we've never used before. Saying that a side length is congruent to itself is what's called the reflexive property. And really saying anything that is equal or congruent to itself is a reflexive property. In geometry, if we say that side lengths are congruent to themselves or angles are congruent to themselves, we call that the reflexive property as well. All right, so we've got side angle side. Let's mark that AC is congruent to itself. And now we move on to our last statement, which is always just rewriting the prove statement. So triangle ABC is congruent to triangle ADC, and we know now that that's because of side angle side. All right, one more type of congruency today. We're going to talk about side, side, side. Pretty easy to visualize, but a little trickier to name corresponding parts. Side, side, side means that you have all 3 corresponding sides that are congruent in your 2 triangles. If you're given measures, that's pretty easy. Just match your measures. We have 2 sides that are 3 inches, a pair of sides that are 4 inches, and the last 2 sides are both 5 inches. So all 3 sides are congruent and corresponding. So these 2 triangles are definitely congruent. And we can complete the congruency statement. So what corresponds with A? This is where it gets a little tricky. I think that matching angles, even though we're looking at sides, is a little easier because notice if you say side AB, what corresponds with side AB? Well, we know that FE corresponds, but are we going to say FE or EF? That's what makes it tricky. So we have to figure out what angle corresponds with A. And so the way that I like to do it is I just look at the markings on the sides and I say that A is in between the markings of 2 and 3. So over here in this triangle, the angle that's in between the markings of 2 and 3 is E. So we know that E and A correspond, and so that means that AB is going to correspond with EF. You could also say F is in between the 1 and the 3 markings, and B is in between of the 1 and 3 markings over here. So F and B must correspond. And lastly, C and D correspond. They're the angle that's in between the 1 and the 2 marks. In this next example, we got 2 side lengths that are both 50 and 2 side lengths that are both 37 inches. But that 3rd side length is slightly off, so these 2 triangles are not exactly the same size. They are not congruent. Only 2 out of the 3 sides were corresponding and congruent, so do not complete the congruency statement. In this last example, the angle markings are telling us what are congruent. So we have a pair there that are the same, another pair that has 2 marks, and then if you remember that if something is shared, it's congruent to itself. So that segment, according to the reflexive property, is also congruent to itself, and so we have 3 corresponding congruent sides. We can complete the congruency statement. This example is a little easier because J and G are the exact same on both triangles, so they must correspond to each other in the same order. And so the only thing left over is the K corresponding with the L. All right, one more time. Let's do a proof. We'll go through those steps again. We'll try and hammer them down. First step is rewrite the given statement. So segment AB is congruent to segment DE. If we've stated it, but it's not in our diagram, let's make sure it's drawn. In this case, I believe those markings were given to us. So we move on to the next given statement. C is the midpoint of segment AE and DB. Again, reason is given. But what does that allow us to draw in our picture? It actually allows us to draw two things. We'll take it one step at a time. If C is the midpoint of AE, that must mean that AC and EC, the two halves on either side of the midpoint, must be the same length. So because I marked them as being the same, I got to state it. So we're going to say AC is congruent to EC. And the reason that we said that those two halves were equal is because of the definition of the midpoint. Because we were told that C is a midpoint, then we know that the two segments on either side are equal. That is the definition of a midpoint. It told us that it was also the midpoint of DB. So in segment DB, that's also split into two equal halves. So we know that BC and DC are also congruent segments. It doesn't matter which statement you say, number 3 or number 4, as long as they are both underneath statement 2, we'll be okay. So now we look at our triangles. We have 3 corresponding congruent pieces. They're all sides, so that must be side, side, side congruency. So our last step, rewrite the prove statement. And your reason is what was shown, side, side, side. All right, lastly, if you were stuck on that last one, occasionally I may give you possible reasons and statements, of course out of order, and you should see that on your next quiz. So be able to do a proof, either using those given statements and reasons, or do it on your own if you're able to. Be able to recognize some of those types of congruence, side, 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 angle, side, and previous to this lesson we did angle, side, angle. And then lastly, be able to mark up congruence pieces based on a congruency statement, such as this. Know how to mark up your triangles with those symbols. All right, good luck. Keep practicing those proofs, and we'll do a few more lessons before we get to our test.